You're listening to Crush Performance, your weekly source for sport performance and athletic development information. Get the Crush blogs, podcasts, and performance links at crushperformance.com. Now, here he is, the Crusher.
Every athlete, regardless of their level of competition, will experience doubt at some point. Doubt about whether they're playing as well as they could be playing, or whether they're progressing as fast as they should be progressing, or whether they're going to be good enough in the end to achieve their goals and directives. I think doubt is a natural part of the developmental process, and it's also maybe a helpful tool at certain periods. It can help you recalibrate your thinking or reevaluate where you're at. So I think the good news is, one, athletes, you're not alone, and two, embrace doubt for what it is, an opportunity to reflect and see if you're actually on track to achieving your goals, because it is a process. Anywhere we're working to acquire mastery or a skill set, in sport or outside of sport, it's a process of development, and sometimes that process takes time. It is surrounded and embedded with periods of success and periods of failure. If you can treat both of those equally the same in terms of respect and learning, you'll be fine in the end. You will find out how good you can become, how good you can actually play the sport you love or do whatever it is you're doing in terms of your goals and objectives. Last week, we had a great roundtable with some of my best sporting friends, and the idea behind that roundtable was to look at elite sport, the best performers, the toughest schedule, the toughest championship to win, all in the spirit of helping us understand what it looks like up there, because I think sometimes we don't realize what it truly takes to achieve mastery, especially in the world of sport. It is a long game. And today I want to talk about that long game with one of my good friends, Kevin Tyler, the president of Altus. Kevin's worked with athletes in multiple sports, but he comes from the track and field world where discipline and hundreds, even thousands of milliseconds are the difference between winning a gold medal and not finishing in the top 5. So today, I want to talk with Kevin about the process of development, some of the experiences he's had with some of the world's fastest, most elite athletes. And at the end, we're going to tie it all together to see how it can help you cast a shadow on that doubt, or maybe even better, use any doubt you might have as you go through your developmental process to your advantage. Today on Crush Performance, it is a true performance conversation with Kevin Tyler, president of Altus. All right, I'd like to welcome my good friend Kevin Tyler, who is the president of Altus. Kevin, welcome back to the show, my friend. It's been some time since you've been on Crush Performance here.
Yeah, it has been some time. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate the opportunity to come back on air. I think it was 19 years ago when I was originally on the show.
19 years, I think you're right. When we met, you were up here in Edmonton working in the high performance world, and I somehow our paths crossed. But man, ever since then, it's been fantastic visiting with you guys, because I often say, you guys work in such a cool area of sport performance. When I'm focused in on my baseball guys, it's nice to get out and just share ideas with people who are doing some different things. It makes everybody better. And I'll tell you, some of those conversations and hanging out with you guys on the track, it has served my athletes well, Kevin. So I want to just say how much I appreciate your willingness to share, man.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. I think we made a decision early on, and it probably goes back to some of the early work we were doing in Edmonton at the Canadian Athletics Coaching Center. Was we just made a commitment to transparency from the onset. And, that's just the best way to exchange information. And, like we said, when people come down here, we're learning just as much as they are when they walk away, because this integration of all these different abilities from all these different sports.
Yep, I love it, Kev. Let's talk about this and the whole evolution of Altus. Maybe give our listeners, again, maybe a quick background in your story. You had an interesting trip, man, to where you're at right now. But this whole Altus thing is great. And you guys, it's www.altus.world to check out their great information. But, you go onto the website, 120 Olympians coached, 56 medals you guys were involved with, 150 years of coaching experience, right? But here's the big one for me. 4,000 coaches educated through your programs, Kevin. Salute, man. Salute. What a great thing.
Yeah, thank you. I think that number is probably a lot larger now than it was. Like
Okay.
we haven't updated the website, for a
Yeah.
little while. I mean, we've just been fully committed from the onset to the development of athletes and coaches in parallel. Like, just from our earlier days working with federations and working in coach development, finding that trying to work with the athlete directly to the exclusion of the coach was always going to fail. And so we wanted to have this environment where there was, like I said earlier, where there's transparency and where coaches could come in and share information and learn at the same rate as their athletes. So they take that information away and be stronger on the ground. And so, I think we're really happy where the organization is right now and the reputation we have and the trust that coaches have placed in us and, the purchasing of our products and, in their professional development, because it's a huge honor.
Yeah. Oh, the education side, Kevin, and and again, going back to your days back here in Edmonton in the Great White North here, but just hanging out on the track, just eye-opening stuff, just get you thinking outside the box a little bit, and that's the beauty of that collaboration you talk about. I love the idea of what you just said, Kevin. Training the athletes independent of their coaches is just it's a very feeble approach to real true development, right? And so I love this idea of the multidisciplinary approach to Altus. Let's talk about this, Kevin. The story of Altus, how you guys came around. How did you wind up here, Kevin?
Yeah, I'll start with the story of Altus, then I'll get to how I wound up there. But so John Godina was world champion in the shot put and was a two-time Olympic medalist. And kind of around the same time that Athletes Performance and Mark Verstegen was starting Athletes Performance in Tempe, John was starting the World Throw Center. And that was probably mid-aughts, 2005, 2006.
Yeah.
And John was sharing facilities with Mark, and they were off the ASU campus. And as things started to evolve, as I said, I'd been in Edmonton, and then based on some of the activity that we'd started there around coach development, I got recruited to go to British Athletics in the lead up to the London Games for that 4-year period. And along with that, Dr. Jerry Ramagita is actually a really good friend of mine. He's, got a Super Bowl ring and a NBA ring as well with Golden State Warriors, and coached treated multiple Olympic gold medalists. He came along, Stuart McMillan came along, and Coach Paff came along. And there was 4 or 5 of us over there during that period. So when we transitioned out of 2012, John was looking to expand from the World Throw Center into the World Athletic Center. And initially, Andres Bain, who coached Darius Merritt to the world record and Olympic gold medalist in 2012, he was at Texas A&M. Andres came on, then Stu came on, and then Coach Paff came on. And at that period, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I was a little later leaving England. I stayed until Christmas of 2012. And when I transitioned out, I had an opportunity through another friend to go to the University of Oklahoma to be the sprint and hurdle coach there. And I really wanted to try that, having coached in what was then the CIS, and get an opportunity to work in the NCAA. So I did that for 2 years. And just as a byproduct of that, in December of 2015, I came to Altus. And then we were still World Athletic Center at that point. And I think literally within that next 12-month period, we transitioned to Altus because what we were doing, the activities that we were doing, spoke more to performance sport than they did just purely track and field. And so we wanted a brand that had the flexibility to absorb that kind of activity.
Yeah, I love it. And so when we look at Altus right now, you guys have an unbelievable roster of athletes and coaches and organizations you work with right now. Let's talk about that, Kevin. That's got to be some of the most rewarding stuff that you guys do there, right? How this thing is sort of morphed into this multi-sport. I mean, hey, human performance is human performance.
Right. So, I think like for us, like if you look at what it is we do, the coach development is incredibly important in the educational services we provide. And then I think secondarily, consulting with organizations and coaches from a technical standpoint, like I said, we were talking off camera there, we've worked with baseball, hockey, basketball, NFL, and obviously over the last 5 years, we've been well positioned with this kind of, massive interest in acceleration and speed that's come about in the strength and conditioning industry, and it's very nuanced, and it's hard for people to learn in a short period of time. So we played a pretty foundational role there in helping organizations understand, acceleration, speed, how to implement it properly. And then I say the third piece then is the athlete component and the training component. And since the early days, we've transitioned a long way from this large athlete base that we had. My first season, I had 23 athletes. We had 105 athletes on the ground. I remember there being 150 to 160 athletes on the track with the contracted Chinese athletes we had. And
Wow.
it was chaos. It was chaos,
Yeah.
but that's what we had to do at that point to bring in the revenue to drive the other aspects of the business. But as we've been able to utilize, access digital revenues, it's given us the opportunity to move more into smaller athlete populations where we, kind of can fulfill our ego a little bit and satisfy our own personal coaching needs, but also to have a population that can be extremely helpful in the educational processes. So when people come and visit us, we have a high performance athlete base where people can watch therapeutic aspects, the training aspects, the stuff that's happening in the gym and on the track as you witnessed, right? And so right now they all fit really nicely together. But again, the most important things for us are the education of coaches, the consultation with organizations and helping them understand this content and apply it properly. And then our own athlete population, which is small. We're down to about 12 athletes now. We just want to have, just have a small group of really high performing people. And then of course we'll have a lot of international people come in and visit temporarily.
Fantastic, Kevin. We're talking with Kevin Tyler, president of Altus. You can check their great stuff out at altus.world on the internet. So I love this, Kevin. I had 120 athletes, 140. I got flashbacks of spring training there, man, where everybody's down at the complex and it is absolute chaos. Good times though, for sure. But I love the idea of really honing in. But one thing you mentioned there really, really sort of resonates with me, Kev, this idea of this multidisciplinary team, everybody with their specialty, but working in unison, right? I think, in a lot of sporting organizations or in the world of sport, especially the developmental levels, athletes don't typically get access to that. But I think the more we talk about it and the more awareness we bring to this type of an approach, the better it is for sport. Let's talk about that multidisciplinary approach there, because you guys have an unbelievable wealth of knowledge in that organization.
Yeah, I think if you look at something like, obviously we've all been benefactors of the expertise of Coach Paff, and even before that, that I have experience with training with Charlie Francis, and a lot of the principles that he put out into the field were incredibly informative in my early years of coaching, and they all kind of felt the same way about the relationship with medical and the other support staff. And I think one of the things that, like, right from the onset, you have to establish a culture that is embracing of that. And sometimes it's easy to say that in paper or in proposals. I mean, I submitted lots of proposals when I worked for British Athletics. We're going to build world-class leading performance, blah, 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 blah. Every organization says the same thing. But if you can't establish that culture that's supportive of that, it's very difficult to implement. And so in our case, we've always said, we're going to drop the ego. There can't be any ego on the ground, because we have to respect everyone for the expertise that they bring to the table, understanding that the primary coach is driving the bus. Okay. And as long as everyone can fall in within kind of that framework, we're going to do really well together. So, as a general rule, and Coach Paff has talked about this quite a bit, and it's extensively discussed in the performance therapy course that we offer. He talks about, the triad between the athlete, the coach, and the therapist. And if you have minimal resources, if you can have some kind of relationship between the coach, the athlete, and the therapist, you can do really well. Now, remember, in our sport, I think it's very easy for us to lay out certain models because it's such a pure sport. It's so basic, right? You have one athlete that's lining up and is largely running against the clock. Yes, there's other competition, but if they're doing what they're maximizing, their training and their abilities, then it's really just them against the clock. And if they hit a high performance, they'll rank well against everybody else. So it's a lot simpler environment than the complexity of team sport. And so I think it's nice for people to come in and see what we're doing from that perspective with these teams, because a lot of the complexity has been peeled away, and it's easier for them to see that practice and operation.
Yeah, and I think for people who don't know or might not be familiar with Altus and the true roots of the organization, track and field athletics is kind of where it all came from, right? But I'm really excited to see, you go on the internet, you see the NBA teams, NFL teams, Major League Baseball teams. there's an important thing, and you mentioned it already, that acceleration and speed factor, which you guys specialize in, that can be applied in virtually every sport where there's athletes competing. It's a very different world for sure, but I kind of like the idea that you guys have morphed into that world as well. And this idea of culture, we talk about it on the show quite often, Kevin. And I love the idea that you guys are talking openly about that thing called ego, right? Because I feel that that's one thing that really holds a lot of athletes back. Maybe not even from the athlete side, but even the support team around those athletes.
It's difficult. I mean, I agree 100%. It's difficult to establish that culture because you understand that, like, people have a lot of time, energy, resources invested in the development of their career, and they have objectives for themselves and where they would like to move in their career. So whether they're coaches, whether they're therapists, whether they're from any of the other isms and they're applying their science in the sport environment, they probably have goals and objectives for themselves. And they want to be respected for the knowledge that they bring on the ground. However, that doesn't mean that the skill set that they have is necessarily applicable to the athlete that you have. And the coach has the context. So, Dan constantly says this all has to be filtered through the coach. But if we can create this environment of respect and, and continued development with these personnel, then, for sure, we're going to end up in a better place. And I think the best example of that is at least 5 of our therapists are actively working in the NBA now or have worked in the NBA. And I think the reason why the teams like them is because they have worked within this culture. And then, they know how difficult it is to find someone that can kind of park the ego and put the athlete's best interests in the forefront and proceed from that basis.
Yeah, no, so great. And Kevin, another big word you just dropped on me there, one that's always been sort of, it's been in my consciousness for quite some time, but I find that we don't talk about it that much. And that's the idea of the context, athlete context and player context. So Kev, our audience here, a lot of parents, a lot of coaches watching, developmental coaches, right up to pro guys. We'll have GMs watching the show, for crying out loud, but a lot of athletes as well, developing athletes. This idea of player context, I just think it's one of those maybe not misunderstood, but not talked about elements of the sporting world, understanding, that athlete, but maybe even along with that, where that athlete is right now in relationship to where they want to go. Is that kind of how you would talk about context?
Absolutely. It's a big point of discussion, even in athletics, even within high performance athletics. So if we think you're probably dealing with a more uniform group of, like, if we're talking about sprinters or hurdlers at the elite level going to the Olympic Games, that's probably a more uniform group of people. But
Sure.
even within that group, there is high variability. Everybody brings different attributes with them, whether their motor preference, how they produce force, and how you would train them as a result of that is all very different. And so the discussion is kind of like when we're speaking to an athlete, and they're potentially thinking about coming to train with us, we're an environment where we're going to try and figure out what best works for you. And I'm not even saying that this is necessarily the best approach within this elite athletic population. I mean, there are some environments you will go to them and they will have one program and you will do that program and it will either be successful or it won't be successful. If it's not successful, you get back on the carousel and you go to the next coach. We've tried to establish an environment where you need to spend a little bit of time with us, 1, 2, 3, 4 seasons, and we're going to keep trying to dial in where your strengths are to maximize those strengths. Okay. Now, at times that's difficult because you're, as a coach, you're often going into spaces that aren't super familiar with you. Like if you have 2 very different types of athletes and you're really strong in this methodology, not so strong in this methodology, you're having to learn really quickly over here. But it also makes you a stronger coach in the end. So when you take this down to developmental athletes, absolutely. I mean, there's so many variables in young people's lives right now that you cannot just push ahead with a program without understanding all the things that are going on in both their personal, their academic, and their athletic lives.
Hey, Kev, ever since I've known you, and even before then, you and I have had some great conversations on this already. but I've always been fascinated in the process of long-term development. And you just dropped a bomb here that I don't know if a lot of people picked up on, but you just casually mentioned, we'll work through 4 or 5 seasons to really get a feel for it. That's the long game, man. We are in a peak by Friday society, man. And I just don't think it serves a lot of young athletes very well. Everybody wants to be the best right now. But on that note, one of the things I've been sort of hyper focused on recovery. Again, you and I talked about this way back in the day, but I have really invested so much time in understanding athlete recovery in all different kinds of scenarios. And it's, I think, really been enlightening for me. But on that note, Kev, in terms of player context, getting an understanding of where an athlete is right now, I think we really missed the boat. In my experiences, even at the highest level of sport, not understanding where that athlete is at right now based on where they've come from and maybe past training experiences or competitive experiences, but physiologically, mentally, emotionally, where they're at right now, regardless of whether they're a 10-year veteran or they're a young kid coming up. Hey, if an athlete comes to Altus, let's talk about this, Kev. What would you like to see in terms of, hey guys, if you're trying to understand where an athlete is at right now, what's the process there, I guess, Kev, is the question.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I think, let me just back up a little bit. I think we'll always start from, especially when we're talking to parents of young athletes, and, we're running a couple of camps in the summer. It's not really what we don't really do. It's not our primary business. We're not a camp-based business, but we run 50 or 60 kids through these camps in the summer, North Dakota, Minnesota this year. We really like to have contact with that population and see how things are evolving and speaking to the parents. And it helps our development as well to be able to coach in that space. Sure. And so what we'll always say to them is that what is the end objective? And understand what the demands are when you get to that end objective. So if it's to get a scholarship in the NCAA, okay, that's one thing, but what are going to be the demands in the NCAA? Or if you want to be a professional athlete, what are the demands of being a professional athlete? And then you have to set up some kind of, let's forget about periodization. You need to set up a general plan that is going to take you from where you are now to where you want to be, or what the demands are that are going to be placed on you when you're in your goal environment. And so, like from our perspective, there's nothing revelational there. If we're taking a track and field athlete in, typically our population is coming in from they're post-collegiate. They've been in a very intensive 4-year college where they've probably raced, like I think Andre DeGrasse, when he came to us from USC, had raced 45 or 50 times the previous year. So there's a lot of repetition there, and we're really just starting to look at the very basic elements of movement and how they move, and their rhythms, how they manage forces, how is amortization on the ground, how are they producing force, a lot of focus around, different movement principles and looking at all the joints and how the whole body works together, and then often still, even in this environment, we end up with athletes that don't, like for instance, like a sprinter. If a sprinter doesn't accelerate well, that's where we're going to start. And then we'll get in the weight room and kind of based on what we think their motor preferences and how they move, then we're going to start to structure a lot of their strength work around their strengths, because these guys are very mature. They're very late in their career. We don't spend a lot of time necessarily going after their weaknesses, if that makes sense. Because totally. If you take an athlete that is kind of force deficient and has has weaker acceleration, but is really good at maximum velocity, right? If you try and reverse engineer that athlete where you get a lot of maximal strength, a lot of plyometric work, and try and increase force production over longer ground contact times, often you will just mess the athlete up, right? You're moving them away from what it is they're good at. And at the level we're at now, we're really focusing on where they're good.
Oh man, you are preaching to the choir here, Mr. Man. Like, one of the things when we sit down with teams, organizations, or families of developing athletes, or even our pro guys, one of the things we always talk about, Kevin, I think you'll appreciate this coming off of this conversation, is we say, hey man, be the best at what you're good at, right? So always, and that's one of the philosophies. Maybe you and I talked about that back in the day, but I just really do believe that if you're set up to be good at something in your sport, regardless of what it is, work to be the best at that and maybe hedge up the rest later on. I love that approach, Kev.
Yeah, and I think like it's a little bit different with field sport athletes. Like
Sure.
we'll handle them a little bit differently. I'm talking about like kind of in that elite track and field population where they're already kind of at the highest, 0.5% of the world. Kind of this notion of just working on their strength, because I've seen far too many athletes that have like, oh, I've got, you can improve this, 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 and this, and they end up getting slower. All right. And
Right.
then the question is why? Well, it's because the one thing that they did really well, you've taken away from them because they haven't been exposed to it enough, or you're involved with a lot of kind of activities that are competing for resources with their main quality.
Yeah. And Kev, and again, this I guess comes with experience, right? And that's why I love that you guys are open door, transparent policy, because here's a conversation we have to have today, Kevin. And that is the idea of the time it takes for mastery in sport,
Yeah.
right? It's a long game. And I just see so many young athletes, even athletes entering the professional realms. Like they get into the high performance pathway. Maybe they're drafted, maybe they're in their first year of a contract. They want everything to happen so fast. And this was a eye opener for me. I did my degree at University of Calgary, worked in the Olympic Training Center there, where I really got into that 4-year quadrennial plan. And depending on the podium readiness of an athlete, that might be 4 years, 8 years, a 12-year plan sometimes if the athletes were young enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I got thrown into the world of professional sport where it's pedal to the metal, perform now or it's over, man, what a transition. And I think this conversation might give people some peace of mind, Kevin, for our audience, as to the time it takes for mastery. You can constantly be getting better, but it takes time, right?
It takes a lot of time. I mean, you can have a significant amount of success at a young age, and but there's always room to improve, and particularly in areas of consistency. Like one of the things we'll talk to athletes about is like, what's the average of your top 5 best performances? Let's not just look at your best performance, but let's look at the average of your top 5, and let's try and move that along. Let's try and get you to become a more consistent performer rather than having one major outlier that they've only touched once at a major championship and they've never been anywhere near it before. So like that time in is very important. The challenge down here in the United States now, and I'll speak to track and field, but I think it's happening in everything, is that there's a lot of changes on the ground with the transfer portal and NIL and this need to do well immediately.
Yeah.
And so standards even with athletics for female athletes, and typically there's more positions on the team for females than males, at least relative to scholarships, because of gender equity, Title IX, and vis-a-vis American football. Walk-on standards are like being slashed in half, like incredibly difficult to get into the program now because we're starting to deal with roster limits, and because the institutions can only afford to have so many athletes in the program, and they can only afford to compensate athletes to a certain degree. And so we're seeing the end of these periods where there's 120 athletes on the team, where the colleges actually have a developmental role with their freshmen and their sophomores. And now the major programs are expecting these kids to be at NCAA championship level from the moment they come into the program, which makes it very difficult for these younger athletes that are developing. And secondarily, it's difficult for anyone working in the performance space because the stress is on them to get this athlete ready immediately, because the only way they're going to college is if they get a scholarship. Like you can't, we talked about context, right? You can't start working with that athlete without understanding that context of their objective and what it is they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that's one of the massive hurdles to overcome. And again, maybe one of the reasons why planning becomes even more important, because now we're getting cramped into smaller spaces, smaller and smaller time frames.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, I've seen some, you've met Derek Evely before, and tremendous story of the developmental job he did with both Shane Niemi, who was the first Canadian to break 45 seconds on 400 meters, Gary Reed, who was world championship silver medalist, 4th at the Olympics, Canadian record holder in the 800, 143, Dylan Armstrong. I can't even tell you how many medals he won internationally in the shot put and the hammer. They all came from Kamloops, British Columbia. Derek started with all of them when they were 14, 15, 16 years old. They all started doing multi-events. They all had very good multi-planar general strength programs that they did religiously. developed a lot of capacity when they were young. And if you talk to anyone that coached those three athletes as they moved on to their professional career, and I was fortunate enough to have Shane, was that they were never hurt. Their entire career, those three never got hurt. I think to the extent that Dylan had some elbow inflammation at the end of his career, which would be expected with an elite shot putter that's over 30 years of age. So that says something about what's possible if you're organized and you understand where it is you're trying to get to, and you build your program progressively to get to that point, starting with the context of the athlete at this immediate point of time.
Oh yeah, I had so many great conversations with Derek. He is another superstar in athlete development for sure. So no, it's great to hear his name again. I haven't talked to him for a long time too, but that's the power of coaching, though, Kev. This idea of coaching and sharing information. This is great. We're talking with Kevin Tyler, president of Altus. You can go to altus.world to check out their great information on the internet. You bring up another very powerful thought for me, Kevin, because it's an issue in the team sports that I deal with. And, I'm lucky enough to work in pretty much every professional sport right now. But now my passion has kind of changed, Kevin. Working with the pro guys is so rewarding and great. I've got a great amount of time there. But I'm looking to where the real issues lie. And it's just what you said and where Kevin started. The issue down in our youth levels of development, man. What an absolute disaster. And I'm not afraid to say it for sure. But, when you talked about Andre DeGrasse coming to you, what I think you said, like 60, 70 competitions the year before. One of the things we're really battling with in sport in general, I suppose, and this would be a great conversation to have with you, is this idea of competition versus training, not just over the course of a competitive year, but over the course of a lifetime of an athlete. And that conversation with Derek, really building that base with those young athletes so they could aspire, 6-7 years later as world-class athletes. That's a story that needs to be told.
Right. Derek and I were in Edmonton there for 4.5 years together. And I mean, I've got this line drilled into my head, which is like, you can have specificity in your program, just don't specialize. And that was his whole attitude around youth development, right? It's competition is highly specific. There's specificity in that, but it doesn't mean, for instance, that you need to be training every capability or capacity that speaks to that event. And the sprint that I've had the most success with is, just happens to the way we're structured is the men's 400 meters. I cannot tell you of a 15 or 16-year-old 400 meter runner that was highly successful at that age that went on to be really successful as a 26, 27, 28-year-old, because you only have so many years where you can do the most, specialized finite work. And do you really want to be running full out 350 meter sprints, for 14 years from the age of 15, and then all the qualities that underlie that, like, your movement profile, your ability to produce force, your acceleration qualities, your maximum speed, your speed reserve, all these things have to be developed prior to you being able to perform at the highest levels in that competitive event. And that's exactly what Derek did with Gary Reed in the 800 meters. Gary actually started out as a really skinny decathlete, but then went to the 400, made the Canadian senior team in the 400 meters as the Canadian junior champion, ran the men's 4x4 in Edmonton in 2001 when World Championships were there on the Canadian team. And it wasn't until he was 19 that he went to Win Gimitrowski to start specializing in the 800 meters. But he'd already run 46 flat, and he already had a lot of those really foundational skill sets developed from his 5 or 6 years with Derek.
This is such an important conversation, Kevin, for parents who are listening, for organizers and coaches of youth sport. I mean, honest to goodness, even pro organizations understanding the ebb and flow of an athlete's development at the highest level of sport. So I want to tell you a story here. I think you'll appreciate this. So I was working with a bunch of tennis people, and I've got to meet some great people around the world in tennis. But one of the coaches called me up one day and said, "Hey, Jeff, just want to talk to you a bit, man. I've got this great young female tennis player, junior, ranked in the world, just had a fantastic season." And they had sort of the end of the competitive season, getting ready for the off season, sit down with the mom and dad. And the mom and dad, of course, doing everything to support their daughter with the greatest of intentions, right, Kevin? And the coach was saying, "Hey, listen, they came in and they said, look, why aren't we training like the pros? Why are we? I want my daughter training like Serena Williams trains." And the coach Kevin had I think one of the greatest responses I've ever heard in this type of a situation, because that's a tough situation. Everybody has great intentions for that young athlete, but the coach came back and said, "Yes, okay, that's great, but how about this? How about we take your 14-year-old tennis player who is fantastic, and how about we train her more like the 14-year-old Serena rather than the 32-year-old world triumphant, world-class athlete we're seeing on TV?" And he said that sort of got the parents back down to earth. How about that story, right?
Yeah, that's a great story. Yeah, I mean, I love that story. I think, one of the observations that I've seen, I think if you go back to kind of this more traditional period of athlete development in, let's say, the 1970s, right? Definitely when I was going to high school or, was just entering high school at that period, what was common? You played a fall sport, a winter sport, and a spring sport. And so what's the natural byproduct of that? Well, there's variability in your program. Lots of variability in program. You're probably switching coaches. And so that just, you stop and think about that principle alone for a second. Now, you could have a coach like the tennis coach you just described, or you could have one coach in athletics. Let's just stick to track and field here for the entire season. And, if you lose the lottery and get the wrong coach, then you're exposed to all kinds of bad practice year on, year out. And I've been this notion of rotating through sports. And, we just had, I mean, you would know him if I told you who he was, but an extremely successful NHL player in the summer. And all of the hockey players are sprinting now. I mean, after 12 or 15 sessions, this guy looked like a sprinter. Phenomenal, like really, really good athlete. Okay, really good athlete. And he didn't even really want to engage in it at the beginning. But as he start to felt the progression, he got really excited about how it could help his skating. Okay. And, I kind of just forgot where I'm going here. So,
Well,
um,
no, we were talking about the idea of multiple coaches. I love the idea, like not just multiple sports, but getting feedback from multiple coaches, like you were
yeah.
going through high school, like I was through high school.
Yeah, and that's where I was going with this. Because so with the hockey player, he had played a lot of baseball when he was growing up, and he actually had a decision to make. But then he's got two very distinctive sports, right? And even though he kind of came into hockey late, that athleticism has served him really well in the NHL. And if you get stuck specializing in one sport for long periods of time, it can be extremely detrimental to your development. Simply for the, just let's just do the one thing. You might only get exposed to one coaching methodology for extended periods of time.
Oh
Right.
man, you just gave me goosebumps, because that honestly, that's not a conversation I've had that often, Kev. We're always talking about the benefits, of that variability of sports, but boy, we just rarely talk about the experiences of having different coaches, different feedbacks, different approaches. How 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 wholesome is that, man? And we're missing that a lot nowadays,
Right.
especially now that these teams, it's pay to play now, right? The industry of youth sport is massive. So players now get into these organizations, they're paying money, and they're, even just by resources alone, they're not allowed to go anywhere else now.
Exactly. Yeah. There's boundaries put around what they can do. There's seasons that everything is blocked off. You're on the traveling team. You're fully committed to the program. Your family's fully committed to the program. But I think we can all go back and think about that moment where there was just that one coach, that one special relationship that we had, whether it was in high school or club. That person really, really encouraged us, right? And being exposed to multiple coaches gives the opportunity to find that person who might, relate better to your style and your preferences.
Yeah, no magic. We're talking with Kevin Tyler, president of Altus, altus.world on the internet. Coach Belichick has a great quote, and it's actually on my corkboard over here in my office. He said, um, um, good players cannot overcome bad coaching. That's a quote from him, and that's something that resonated with me for years and years, most certainly. One of the things that we talk about, Kev, this idea of specialization, right? And there's a big conversation around that now, because again, the world of sport is changing, the landscape of sport development is changing, The industrialization of youth sport is a big part of that. But Kevin, when we go and look at the numbers, the NCAA numbers, or even go look at the last 3 NFL drafts, I think the last NFL draft, 29 or 30 of the top 32 picks were multi-sport athletes up to the age of 15. I think the number is, and I'm kind of, this is ballpark, but I think it's 94.7. I think that's the number. I'll go back and double check. But when they poll and look at NCAA Division I athletes, 94+% were multi-sport athletes going into that phase of their career. So there's a lot to be said. But again, Kev, not just from the standpoint of, playing different sports and getting those experiences, man, oh man, getting exposed to different ideologies and different thoughts from the coaches you experience. What a powerful thing to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. I think, you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, it's, that ability to, just think about this even from a young person, from a psychological perspective, and emotional burnout that comes from repetitive activity. I know, like, even within athletics, we know that at this senior level, this is USA Track and Field's own statistics. The team, 85% of the team is turning over every 2 years. And so that when you think about that, that means basically what's happening is that every 2 years, that group of college graduates, or the guys that are juniors or seniors that are able to get onto the national team, they're coming into the program, they're lasting a couple years, and then they're out. And you have this 15%, the Noah Lyles that you see at the Olympics, and they're on NBC, and they're at a level where they're making enough money and they have enough backup, and their ability is at such a high level they can afford to have some fluctuations and still remain relevant in their program. But these other people near the bottom of the program, they don't have that luxury, right? And the sports specialization is so demanding, both physically and emotionally, that if you haven't created this window for yourself where you are allowed to enjoy sport, where you're allowed to experience movement, where you're allowed to play in a whole bunch of different environments, and not only that, learn how to interrelate with other athletes, particularly track field athletes who aren't necessarily in a team event, these are all important elements to our development.
Yeah, no, so great, Kev. No, it's just important conversations. And again, context for young athletes who are maybe aspiring into that high performance pathway, but also for the parents as well. Because I mentioned, I think everybody has good intentions, right? But you still have to wade through, you have to go through the process. I was lucky enough to be asked to present at MLB winter meetings in 2018 in Las Vegas. Okay. And I'm going, okay, well, guys, listen, there's 300 of the most brilliant people in sport, amongst the teams. What do you need me to talk about? And they said, hey, they knew I was really deep diving into the idea of recovery. The injury rates in sport, Kevin, are off the charts, despite everything we know, even to this day. And I'm talking more MLB, NFL. We look what's happening in the NBA. A lot of it, though, when I talk to the guys in these different sports, the type of injuries they're seeing in their young players, Kevin, they're things that they never used to see till the end of a career. So that automatically makes me start thinking, what's going on at the youth levels, right? The overuse, the specialization, the one sport approach early on. There's got to be a way that we can sort of tame that back, and maybe helping people understand that the diversity early on is a good thing to the end result. Maybe that's a conversation we need to have more.
Yeah, because if you have variability in your program from a young age, I think that's going to make you more resilient, more robust moving forward as you move into the more specific demands of whether collegiate athletics or professional athletics. Our experience is, and this is very much so in track and field, but also the team sports that we worked with, if you kind of divided their capabilities up into like kind of physical capabilities of the player, their capacities, force production, those kinds of elements, right, versus the technical capabilities, that there's always a really strong focus on these kind of physical elements. And yet there's less attention paid to the technical elements. Well, that is a recipe for disaster, where you're increasing loading on a structure that's not ready for it. If the technical elements aren't in place, these physical exposures that you're giving them are too high, and they overload the system. And so constantly, like, the best story I have, because you and I haven't talked for a while, myself and Steve Fudge, who was in UK, was a sprint coach. We were working together at Loughborough University, and there was an athlete there that had a lot of promise. He had run 10:09 on the 100 meters, super gifted. If you watch him accelerate, you just like, even as a sprint coach, you were like, that guy is special, right? You could tell. And he had a really good relationship with his coach, but he had been injured like 16 times in 5 years. And because there was, we have medical premises on the facility, at the facility, we had records on everything, right? And he just kept ping-ponging between the track and the clinic and the track and the clinic and the track and the clinic. He'd get treated, he'd get released, and then he'd go back onto the track and he'd get injured again. And so we started working with him in January of 2012, which was the Olympic year. He came to us with a grade 2 hamstring injury and basically said, look, my Olympic dream's almost over. I have to make a coaching switch. What can you do? And in 18 months, he became number one in the world in the 60 meters. His 60 went from 661 to 648. And I think within 2 years, his 100 went from 10:09 to 9:91. And we actually got him to the Olympics that year. We didn't run over 60 meters once in practice because we just spent a lot of time focusing on the technical elements. He got in the heat, his heat at the London Olympics. He was side by side with Usain Bolt. And so we're like, okay, we expected him to make the semifinal. Like that was about where we were trained up to at that point. The final was probably a reach. But at 35 meters, we have this picture of him. He's side by side with Bolt and they are clear of the field. And Steve and I are like looking at each other going, this guy's legit. He's going to be the real thing. Like this is what we've been able to do in 6-7 months. Just think of what you can do over an extended period of time, which then Steve took him to 9:91. I think he was the fastest man in Europe, World Championship finalist type person. But simply that all of the focus had been on his physical capabilities and not his technical capabilities or not his technical capacity.
Wow, man.
Right. And so he was just putting himself in at-risk positions constantly. Being overloaded in those at-risk positions was affecting the length tension relationships of all of his connective tissue. And, you just get in a bad place, you're reaching, and next thing you know, hamstring injury. And it's not just a minor hamstring injury with these guys, because when they're moving 12 meters a second and they're in a bad position, it's typically a major issue.
Kevin, that is a masterclass conversation in the heading of pure athlete management, right? That is such a great story, and just hearing you say that brings to mind Jerry Rice. Jerry Rice, he literally said one of the reasons he was able to play so long in such a brutal sport is he never practiced the sport at game speed, no contact. Like he would practice receiving routes, but he would never get involved in the contact side of practice. Another gentleman that I had the honor of working with, Rod Carew, one of the greatest hitters in the history of baseball. I talked to him about his approach over the course of his career. He said in practice, he rarely swung at the ball. He spent more time watching the ball. And then when he was connecting the dots, he would take some swings, but he spent more time observing and learning than he did actually training at intensity. Kevin, in my world, the baseball world, and again, I want to maybe just expand on this with you a little bit, because this is one of the most important conversations I think we could have. There's this rush for velocity now in baseball, and not just on the base paths, man. We know speed and explosiveness, it's a quickness sport, right? So that's fun, right? The running side, but the throwing velocity now, right? I mean, there's such a push, and now we're seeing all these velocity programs coming out that are getting now, 15, 16-year-olds attacking on 10 miles an hour onto their pitching velocities. And that's something that typically in the past might have taken, 3 or 4 years. They're training and they're getting it done in 10 months now. And what happens? Well, what happens. Just look at the injury rates out there. The fastest growing orthopedic procedure in the United States, and this is talking with the MLB medical people, is Tommy John surgery in athletes under 15 years of age. And Kevin, I think what you just said right there, about you guys taking a step back from intensity to build performance, that's almost counterintuitive for people.
Yeah, it's just like building blocks, right? And so don't get me wrong, we will definitely tap into that highly specific, high velocity work, but you don't get there until you can do steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, block A, block B, and block C properly first, right? And Coach Paff and talk to Coach McMillan, they'll all say the same thing, is that what happens in the first 3 to 5 steps is going to show up down the track. And so if you start making missteps early, and it could be for a number of reasons, it could just simply because of your strength levels, because of postural issues, because of asymmetries, because of your coordinative patterns, or because of your understanding of the movement, that might not align, and it might put you in a position that puts you at risk. And so we will start literally like with the hockey player. The hockey player I told this summer is, you're one of the best players in the world. And I'm going to tell you this right now. I know you want to be running to 30 meters. You are not getting injured on my watch. I am not going to be the person responsible for you going to training camp with a hamstring injury. We're going to start at step one. You're going to learn how to stand. You're going to learn how to initiate the acceleration. You're going to learn how to initiate the swing leg. And when you can show me that you can project over 3 to 5 steps, we will start to lengthen you out. At first, he was really frustrated the first 3-4 sessions because, look, am I going to get to run more than 5 yards? No, until, you do this right.
You earned it, mister. Right?
Yeah. And then he earned it. Like you said, he earned it. And by the end, by, 12, 15 sessions in, he's running full out to 30 meters. He's running, he's on the 1080 pulling resistance to 30 meters. We're sending videos back to his coaches and they're like, this is phenomenal. Like, he's the example on our team now. But if you skip steps, you are going to pay the price somewhere else. Yeah. And sure, you could have high levels of performance for short periods of time, but you have to ask yourself, what do you want for yourself, or what do you want for your child? And if you want your child to have a positive, long career in the sport, and however long that is, whether that's, whether it's high school varsity, collegiate, or professional, then don't skip steps. Find programs that don't skip steps. And like you said, how many of those players, that you quoted were, involved in multi-sport until they're 15, 16 years of age, right?
Yeah, not many nowadays. Oh, okay. Such a great conversation. Hey, and I think I just sort of like to wrap it up with this, going back to that conversation you had. What a great conversation, man. Oh, I'm so glad you were able to come on today, Kev. This is just so timely. Watching the Olympics, every time I see the Olympics or an athlete, I always think of you and Derek and some of the things that I saw down there. So I'm so glad to have this conversation, especially right now when we see what's going on in sport. Let's just maybe, Kev, I'm going to ask you two things. One, just this question right here. Going back to that conversation you had about the lifespan of that track athlete you were working with, where you spent years, seasons building the blocks because there's only a small window of opportunity to actually perform at a high level. And I think people want that early on and they're just skipping those processes. So that's one thing. And then maybe in that, Kevin, for the parents, coaches, the athletes that are listening to the show, any kind of closing remarks from you and all the experiences that you've had there at Altus, just sort of to sum all this up? I don't know if it's even possible, man. What a great conversation.
Yeah. So, in terms of like athlete development over a longer period of time, like I said, if you look at someone, even say like an Andre DeGrasse, who has moved through multiple coaches now, from his college coach to Coach McMillan to Coach Ryder to wherever he ends up this season, right? You see a progression of like 992 to 991 to 989 to, like literally over courses of years. We're talking hundredths of a second. But your ability to consistently repeat those 989s or those 990s instead of it being an outlier then puts you in a position where you can win a medal every competition, right? Where if you're consistently running in the 9.8s, most of the time the odds suggest you're going to be in the final and you're going to be in contention for a medal. I understand fully from a contextual perspective the demands that are placed on the athletes, and they're difficult, right? Which in our sport, like a lot of sports, there isn't a lot of money and it's expensive to do it properly, to have good coaching, have access to facilities, to have the therapy, to have money to get to competitions. And so you're often trying to rush that along because the objective is to become a professional, which is not necessarily professional in our sport, to get a footwear contract, to have some means to support yourself. And so we're constantly having to balance those demands, right? I just had a young athlete here from another country. She wants to go to an American college. She came and visited us for a period of time. And in her country, they run the 400-meter hurdles as opposed to competing the 300-meter hurdles like they do in the United States. If you're training someone for the 300-meter hurdles to go into an American college, you can approach that largely from an Excel speed endurance perspective, right? But now, because they're competing at 400-meter hurdles in their home country, you're taking an athlete that's 16 years of age, and you have to strongly start to think about how are we going to build in enduring capabilities into this program so she can meet her next objective, which is to go to college, but still while respecting these speed qualities. So it's this really difficult balance, right? And so obviously a good coach, and this kind of hits on the second part of your question, is a good coach is going to try and take in that entire context, is going to have a really good developmental framework and map, right? And then they're going to be able to basically shrink or expand it given the demands that the athlete are placing on them. And I also think that, coaches shouldn't be afraid to say, just like your tennis coach did, is either, hey, maybe we should try this, or what you're asking me is not possible.
Right.
And I've seen it attempted, but it's very likely going to end up with this scenario. So it's a choice that you have to make, right? So again, as you know, and I'm sure like every presenter or every person that you speak to that comes on the podcast basically tells you, is that like this is a journey, right? We're trying to develop a lot of physical capabilities, a lot of psychological capabilities, a lot of inherent competitive sense or competitiveness, where someone can compete at the very highest level and give their best possible performance. And that doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, it's a long game, Kevin. Listen, man, what a fantastic conversation. Here's my notes. It's a full page.
Oh, good. I'm glad you got that much from it.
I'll make sense of them later, but there are some valuable gems on here, Kevin. That's a tribute to you and everybody down there at Altus. Hey, listen, man, we need to do this more often. Want to thank you for all that, the great information, and great to catch up again, Mister. I really need to make a point of coming down and maybe spending some time with you guys. That'd be good for me personally.
Yeah, happy to have you down. As you know, we were saying earlier, we're all back in Phoenix now. We will be hosting, apprentice coach programs from the new year, and super excited. We've just announced that in January we've accepted our first cohort for the master's degree in strength and conditioning, which hopefully is going to change the industry. Really trying to create an environment where we have really strong theoretical knowledge with really strong applied contextual experiences for the coaches, because in a lot of programs that kind of the joining of those two elements is kind of missing in a lot of environments. Really good theoretical, but the applied piece is kind of missing. So we're excited about the opportunity this presents.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. And on the last note, just getting back to my MLB story in 2018, Coach Paff presented there that year as well. He presented, I believe, to the strength and conditioning coaches. I was presenting on the medical side, and we actually ran into each other in the hallway, and I had a dynamite conversation with him. And again, just like this, the openness just was almost humbling, man. The sharing of information, and of course, leading up to that, I follow his weekly newsletter as well. Just great information coming out of your whole team there. So kudos to you guys, Kev. I want to thank you guys and everybody there for everything you're doing for sport. I want to learn more about this strength and conditioning program, because I think there's some young professionals I would really love to see get down into that sort of a world. So love everything about it. Thanks again for coming on.
Oh, you're welcome, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Okay, listen, where do we go after that conversation? Fantastic stuff from Kevin there. What a great conversation. That was a masterclass in the process of athlete and coaching development. And again, it all comes around to that unbelievable relationship between the athlete and the coach. Man, being a coach is such a powerful relationship, and something that we shouldn't take lightly at all at any level of sport. But one of the things that Kevin mentioned there that really, I think, resonated with me was the idea of coach sharing. Not just that. You guys know on the show, if you tune in regularly, we talk about specialization here all the time. And we look at the pros and the cons of specialization, early specialization, diving into one sport early in age, which is typically, sort of the boundaries. 10 to 12 years of age, we say, is kind of the age group where you want to make sure you're diverse enough leading up to that to be a well-rounded athlete. But Kevin put a whole new spin on that for me. It's something I think we've talked about before, but I don't really consider it regularly, but it's something as a parent, even as a coach or as a coach of coaches, we need to talk about more. Specializing doesn't just get you honed into one activity, one sport, and take you away from all the other experiences you might get. It also has the potential to have you focus in and only work with one coach or only a few coaches, rather than getting out there in different sports, learning and hearing how different coaches present ideas or develop their athletes. Man, that is fantastic. One of the things I love about Altus, again, their great information is altus.world on the internet. Their coaching development programs are just outstanding. It's one of the reasons I wanted to get Kevin back on the show, but that is a very, very important takeaway for anybody involved, not just in sport, but in leadership and human development, in the business world, in academics, most certainly in sport. Another thing that Kevin talked about there that I really think you need to understand, as we opened the show, we talked about athletes experiencing doubt. It is a true part of the process. How you deal with that doubt is a real weapon for you. Doubt can be a good thing. It can be a time where maybe something's telling you, okay, step back, let's reflect, maybe get input from multiple people that you trust, and then move forward with purpose. I think you can really turn it around into your advantage. Doubt is not necessarily a bad thing. It might just help you calibrate. Are you doing the right things right now to achieve your goals? Are you mapping out your plan moving forward? Is it the best plan possible? And that's another thing that we talked about with Kevin there. Athlete mapping. I always sort of refer to athlete development and athlete performance as taking a trip, right? You got to have a clear idea of where you're going. But most importantly, and one of the things athletes miss, not just athletes, but I sit down with families of young developing athletes in the high performance pathway, or I sit down with organizations and teams and we talk about this. How clearly do we really understand where this athlete is right now? Not so much in relationship to their peers, but in relationship to where they've come from, to where they're at, and to where they need to go next, right? Again, part of the process, but this concept of athlete mapping is really important. And Kevin said something really important that kind of spins off of last week's roundtable show. And again, that show that we did last week was about trying to just sort of calibrate how incredible and how demanding the elite levels of sport are. And Kevin mentioned it there. He said, quite a few people underestimate or don't really understand the demands at the elite levels of sport. And Kevin mentioned the NCAA as a student athlete, the demands to not just perform there as an athlete, but also to maintain academics and forge yourself forward as a person, right? In professional sports, we talk about it on the show all the time. Understanding where you want to go in terms of the landscape can really help you prepare as you make your way there. Another really good point that Kevin made there. And I think the final note, and again, we'll have to go back and listen to this conversation again. This is a doozy. Please share this conversation with your teammates, your fellow coaches, your organizational leaders, because this is a true masterclass, if you listen carefully, on not just athlete development, but human development. When Kevin was talking about Andre DeGrasse, and when Andre first came to the guys, the year before, he'd done something like 70, 72 competitions, which is a lot. I mean, that is a lot of sprints, right? But over the next few years, they're really trying to attack Usain Bolt and Usain Bolt's level of performance. And he talked about, year after year, cutting off tenths, hundredths of a second to actually run alongside and be as fast as the world's fastest runners can possibly be. Imagine taking a year after year after year to take off fractions of a second on a 100-meter sprint. That's how the world of high-performance sport works. Now, Andre had obviously done the mass work, the foundational work to get him there. And that's the last point I want to make about Kevin. When he talked about, some of the pro baseball players coming in, right? And only running first 3 strides. Hey, man, we're not going beyond the first 3 strides until you actually earn the right to go 5 strides, 7 strides, 10 strides, 30 meters, 60 meters, 100 meters. It's that buildup. Unfortunately, in sport today, and I'll say it again, we are honestly, if we look at our developmental models out there with great intentions, I believe we're destroying way more talent than we're creating, because we have this peak by Friday attitude that we should be experts, the highest of performers at every stage of development, rather than stepping back, building the blocks and that rock solid foundation. So when you do finally mature physically, mentally, and emotionally, you're coachable on all 3 of those planes to become a world-class performer. If you are a young athlete out there looking to chase down a dream of sport, if you're parents of one of those athletes, or if you're coaching in a developmental system, please share this conversation. This is one of the more powerful conversations I think we've had on Crush Performance in a long time. And I have to thank Kevin Tyler for all that input, man. I've been looking so forward to getting Kevin back on the show. And I wasn't joking, I would go down to the track, and I even talk about some of my experiences when I go around the globe lecturing. I talk about some of my experiences hanging out with Derek and Kevin and how they treated their 400-meter sprinters. And I just remember one day they were getting ready for, I believe it was the Canadian Olympic qualifiers. So these athletes, the best athletes in Canada, were all getting ready to compete to see who was going to represent Canada at the next Olympics. And so it was like the national event. Anyway, it was a few weeks, if memory serves me, before the competition, and they had the 400-meter sprinters out there. And again, when you see an elite athlete perform, sometimes you just have to step back and appreciate it. The way these athletes moved, the way they prepared themselves, the way they approached their work was so professional. Again, a lot of thanks to both Derek and Kevin for that. But it was impressive to watch. It was like when I went down, if you've ever heard me tell the story, my first time down with the Blue Jays, seeing professional players play catch. It was just different than anything I'd ever seen before. It's such an appreciation for elite performers. But on that day on the track, the training was 3 300-meter sprints, right? And so the sprinters got warmed up and boom, they took off 300 meters as fast as they could, cool down, go watch the video, talk with Kevin, talk with Derek, go get something to drink, check the iPad out, boom, 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 start warming up again. About 20 minutes later, boom, the second bout. Same thing, cool down, talk to Kevin, talk to Derek, check out the iPad, check some things out, boom, boom, get warmed up again. The last one, boom. Here's the thing that I think a lot of people don't appreciate. Those 3 maximum effort bouts, 300 meters as fast as they could possibly go. How much rest do you think those athletes needed before they were able to train again at the maximum level of intensity? How many days do you think? How many hours do you think? Well, this is one of the big problems in sport. We don't really understand the recovery process. And that's why I spent the last 10, 15 years really honing in on that physiology. All right. After running those 300-meter sprints, which is probably collectively, it's less than 3 minutes of high intensity work, less than 4 minutes of high intensity work. I can't remember what their times were, but you know what I'm saying? It really collectively wasn't a lot of work, but it was probably, I think, talking with Derek and Kevin, they weren't going to be working at intensity again until 72 hours, 3 days almost, to fully recover from 3 sprints to sprint again at high intensity. And that's the ebb and flow of athlete development. That's something that's missing. And here's the other thing that's missing. Younger athletes need more rest, whether they're throwing a baseball, swinging a club, whether they're playing a soccer game, whether they're in a contact sport like soccer or a team sport like soccer or rugby or football or hockey or volleyball, basketball. You have to understand the higher intensity, the more rest. The younger the athlete, the more rest. If you look at our youth development programs today, what you'll see on the most part is the opposite. more and more and more and more. One of the reasons we have such epically high, historically high injury rates. Again, just a fantastic conversation. If you really key in and dig down on some of the concepts that were discussed here today, just really, really good stuff. Again, I want to thank Kevin Tyler for joining us. Altus, we're going to get those guys on regularly again. And man, when I'm down in Phoenix next, I will be going to spend a day with those guys just to hang out and talk shop. So much fun. If you guys have any questions, comments, or smart remarks on today's conversation, or if you want more, or if you have questions about what was talked about today, let me know. info@jeffgershell.com is the email, okay? You can direct message me on any of the social media platforms, not a problem at all. But check out our YouTube channel. We're posting all of these interviews on YouTube, so subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're just going to keep building and building and building, and eventually we're going to be sharing some of those drills and sharing some of those concepts, and we're going to be talking to some of the athletes about their experiences as well. So again, I got to thank Kevin Tyler for coming on. I want to thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time right here on Crush Performance.
Find out what it takes to be a top performer. Get the Crush blog, podcast, and newsletter at crushperformance.com.